major AI models compete against each other to see which one could build the best and most engaging 2D platformer. Each model received the same prompt, the same amount of information, and only one opportunity to respond. To keep it fair, I used the medium version of each AI's free basic model. The official 3 competitors are ChatGPT 5.5 Medium, Gemini Flash Thinking, and Claude Sonnet 5 Medium. Once those 3 have been tested and an official winner has been crowned, I have one final bonus competitor, the newly released ChatGPT 5.6 Sol Ultra model, which I can access through my paid account. This one really shocked me, so stay till the end to find out what happened. Let's dive in. Before we begin, we need to establish exactly how this competition is going to work. For each of the 3 main AI platforms, I began in a completely new conversation with no previous context, and every single one received this exact prompt. I asked each model to create a complete, original 2D platformer inside a single HTML file that could open directly in Chrome. It needed responsive controls, 3 increasingly difficult levels, enemies, obstacles, collectibles, and more. There were no follow-up prompts and definitely no repairs. After, it was time to send the games through AI Bootcamp. Now, I didn't want my own biases to show through, so I created a standard 100-point scoring system that rewarded everything from the gravity controls to the player character and enemies. The first category is basic functionality worth 25 points. A game receives 5 points if it opens and reaches a usable title or starting screen, 5 points if movement and jumping actually work, 5 points if death functions correctly, 5 points if the levels transition properly, and 5 final points if the player can reach a working win screen. The second category covers the required gameplay elements and is worth 30 points. The game receives 6 points for containing 3 distinct levels, 4 points for including platforms and obstacles, 4 points for functionable collectibles and scoring, 4 points for enemies, 4 points for moving platforms, 4 points for a working live system, and 4 final points for a usable checkpoint. The third category is game design worth 20 points. 5 points are awarded for responsive controls, 5 for difficulty that increases naturally, 5 for levels that feel enjoyable, and 5 for creating an original idea rather than producing the most generic platformer imaginable. Fourth category is a big one, and its presentation worth 15 points. A game can receive 3 points each for having a cohesive visual theme, character animation, visual effects, sound effects or music, and polished transitions. Finally, the last 10 points are available for reliability and rule compliance. Hopefully all our models achieve those. That gives every game a maximum possible score of 100 points, and with the rules officially locked in, it's time to open our first platformer. First up is ChatGPT 5.5 Medium, and it has somehow decided that a basic platformer was not ambitious enough, because this thing has a crazy name. Lumenfall Echoes of the Skyforge. And within about 5 seconds of opening the game, I can already tell that it's trying extremely hard to win, which is great. The first thing that immediately stands out to me is the character, because this little glowing space robot does not just slide across the screen like a rectangle with legs. It can lean as it moves, it reacts when it lands, it kicks up particles between its feet, and these are all small details, but it gives the character considerably more personality than I expected from a game produced with a single prompt. And the entire world around the character moves with it. The stars drift at different speeds, the clouds move separately from the foreground, the camera smoothly follows the character, and all of these layers actually create a really surprising sense of depth. So as I move through the level, ChatGPT has come out swinging, that's for sure. More importantly though, it actually feels like a platformer. The controls respond quickly, the character builds momentum, and the jump has enough variation that I can make a smaller hop by releasing the button early, or I can also hold it for longer to get a longer jump. It even gives me a tiny amount of forgiveness if I press jump just before landing or immediately after walking off the ledge. And these are the kind of design choices that most players will never notice, but it makes the movement so much smoother. Now, with that being said, there are a few jumps where I'm looking at the platform and then looking back at my character and thinking, there is absolutely no way this little guy is going to get up there. The jumping itself works consistently, but some of the platform placement feels as though it was designed around a slightly more powerful jump than the one the character actually has. Thankfully, dying in this game does not break anything. Falling into one of the glowing voids, or hitting a spike, or touching a saw, or anything else behaves the exact same way I would expect, and the game brings me back with the correct number of lives and health. There are also checkpoints later in each level, which becomes extremely important once the levels start getting longer, because honestly, if I had to repeat a level every single time I missed time to jump, this would turn into a very different kind of review. At this point, basic functionality earns 23 out of those 25 points. Nearly everything works exactly as intended, but those questionable jumps costed those 2 points. Then I discovered the shards, or collectibles, and this is where the game becomes much more interesting. That's because they are not simply scattered around the game as optional decorations. Instead, every shard gives me 100 points in the game, and me being competitive, I want those 100 points. Additionally, every enemy I defeat by landing on top of it gives me another 250 points. But when I finally reach the portal at the end of the first level, the game will not let me leave unless I have collected at least 8 shards. That completely changes how I play the game, because instead of ignoring everything, I actually have to explore the level, and take risks, and use the moving platforms to decide whether a difficult shard is worth pursuing. It gives the collectibles a real purpose, and the requirement rises from 8 shards in the first level, to 12 shards in the second level, and 17 in the third level. Now, I like that idea enough that I am awarding it 1 bonus point. That point is outside the official scoring system, but requiring collectibles to progress is that extra design choice that I was looking for to make the game so much more engaging. The first level is called the Moonlit Foundry, and it has this deep blue industrial space atmosphere. It gives me enough room to learn the movement while gradually introducing certain enemies and spikes, gaps, moving platforms, etc. Then I enter Prism Wind Gardens, where the entire color palette shifts to purple and pink, and enemies are much more prominent. By the time I reach the third level, the Starless Crown, everything has turned gold and crimson, saw blades are moving between platforms, enemies are guarding narrow landing areas, and the level feels considerably more dangerous than where I started. That progression is excellent, and the platforms, enemies, and moving elements are all here, so ChatGPT collects nearly every required gameplay point available. Now, I say nearly because the enemies occasionally walk through the spikes as though the spikes have signed an agreement to only hurt me, which it doesn't destroy the game, but it does make the world feel slightly less coherent and realistic. That brings the required gameplay score to a 29 out of 30. But from a pure game design perspective, I am extremely impressed. The controls are responsive, the challenge increases naturally, the scoring system encourages me to interact with those enemies and collectibles, and most importantly, I'm actually enjoying myself playing this game. ChatGPT earns the full 20 out of 20 for game design. Presentation is also strong, especially with the changing color palettes and the character and the moving platforms. However, there are 2 places where the illusion starts to weaken a little bit. The sound is functional, although what I notice while playing is fairly basic and repetitive compared with the visuals. And secondly, the portal transition feels surprisingly abrupt. I walk into this beautiful, swirling portal expecting the character to get pulled inside, dissolve into particles, or at least move through it. But instead, the character simply stops and the level ends. That missing moment of immersion costs 1 point, while the limited sound design costs another, leaving the presentation at a 13 out of 15. Reliability is our last category, and it gets the full 10 out of 10 because the game is playable with no bugs. So after these levels, ChatGPT's game Lumenfall receives a final score of 96 out of 100. That is an absurdly strong opening score, and if this is what the first model produced, Gemini and Claude now have almost no room to make any mistakes. Let's check it out. Next up is Gemini Flash Thinking, and its game is called Neon Cyber Run, which immediately feels like something I would have discovered on an arcade machine in the corner of a laser tag arena. And honestly, I mean that as a compliment. Gemini has committed completely to this retro cyber theme. The enemies are hostile nodes, the collectibles are core data matrices, and the exit is a neon extraction gateway. And instead of simply pressing start, I have to initialize core, which means beginning this browser platformer feel considerably more important than it probably is. Once I enter the game, the style remains very consistent, with this dark grid stretching across the background, glowing cyan platforms, pink hazards, yellow collectibles, and a small cybernetic character. It is much simpler than ChatGPT's game, but it has a clear arcade identity, which I appreciate. Now let's actually try to move. Okay, wow. This character does not walk so much as immediately commit to a direction, because the second I touch the key, I am flying across the screen. I mean, the camera is just trying to catch up with me, and I'm attempting to process the location of every platform, spike, enemy, and gap before I become extremely familiar with the death sound effect. To Gemini's credit, the controls are responsive in the most literal possible sense. When I press right, the character moves right immediately. When I press left, it changes directions immediately. And when I jump, the game certainly launches me into the air. The problem is that everything reacts so quickly that I never feel fully in control of what is happening, especially when the gravity pulls me back down. The first level is still manageable though, and it introduces all of the main mechanics clearly enough. Those glowing yellow squares are the collectibles, and each one adds 50 points to my score, while those green blocks are enemies that patrol back and forth and can be eliminated by landing on top of them for 150 points. Stomping the enemies is a nice addition, although with movement this fast, attempting to land precisely on top of one feels like placing a very risky bet. There are also checkpoints, moving platforms, 3 hearts of health, pits, and a purple portal waiting at the end of every sector, so all of the fundamental platformer systems are indeed here. When I reach the portal, the game pauses and announces that the sector has been synchronized, because apparently I have broken the encryption and am now ready for the next data layer. Awesome. That transition is honestly pretty cool, and I like how the game carries its cyber terminology into every screen. Dying triggers a system override, restarting becomes purge and reboot. Then I load Sector 2, and this is where the mainframe begins fighting back. The moving platforms are way faster, the gaps are less forgiving, and the spikes are positioned in places that give me almost no time to understand the level before I'm already taking damage. In some attempts, the second sector places me so close to the spikes that I begin moving, immediately collide with them, and then lose health before I even have properly oriented myself, which is not exactly the warm welcome I was hoping for. There are also moments when a checkpoint overlaps with spikes. I appreciate having a checkpoint, but ideally it should not feel as though the checkpoint itself is working for the enemy team. And the moving platforms only become more chaotic as the game continues. By the third sector, some of them are moving almost as quickly as the player can run. I spend less time thinking, how should I approach this obstacle, and considerably more time thinking, maybe if I jump now and hold right, the laws of probability will eventually place me on that platform. The difficulty does increase between sectors, and the later layouts are longer and more demanding, but most of that difficulty comes from making the existing objects faster and harder to navigate rather than introducing completely new challenges. That consistency helps the theme, but it also makes the levels blend together. Now, for basic functionality, Gemini earns a 23 out of 25. The title screen works, death and restarting works, the sectors transition correctly, and the final windscreen appears as intended. But the unusually fast gravity and inconsistent feeling jumps cost it 2 points. Required gameplay earns a 26 out of 30. Gemini includes all 3 sectors, collectibles, and everything else, but the levels lose 2 points because they look so similar. The limited variety of obstacles costs another point, and the moving platforms lose another point because operating them is just so hard. Game design is where the differences become more noticeable. The controls respond immediately, and the difficulty clearly rises, but responsiveness alone does not automatically make this game enjoyable. Sector 2 is already difficult enough that finishing it feels dependent on getting lucky with certain jumps, and then by Sector 3 I am no longer escaping the mainframe, I'm negotiating with it. Now, I wouldn't say the game is completely unenjoyable because there is something entertaining about this frantic arcade energy, and finally surviving one of the more ridiculous sequences does feel satisfying. However, frustration starts replacing strategy far too often, so enjoyment receives a 3 out of 5 while originality receives a 4 out of 5. Altogether, that gives Gemini 17 out of 20 for game design. Now on to presentation. Presentation earns 12 out of those 15 points. The theme receives full credit because Gemini maintains it beautifully across the gameplay. The background is a completely static grid, and the characters are mostly glowing rectangles. And while the collectibles do spin and a few particles appear, the world never develops the same sense of movement or depth that ChatGPT created for me. The sound design is similarly functional, but limited with straightforward electronic effects. That's presentation. But now reliability. Reliability receives a 10 out of 10 because the complete game remains operational from its title screen through all 3 sectors and into the final victory screen. That leaves Gemini Flash Thinking with a final score of 88 out of 100. The mainframe may have been breached, but so was my patience. On to the next. Last up in the official competition is Claude Sonnet 5 Medium, and its game is called Lumen Crystal Caverns, and I'm guiding something called a Light Spirit through 3 underground levels. The first thing I notice is how completely different the movement feels from Gemini's game, because Claude's character has this soft, floaty motion that makes each jump feel very, very smooth. I rise into the air, hang there for just long enough to see where I'm going, and then gradually fall back down towards the platform. So it's safe to say I really like these gravity controls. The character itself is also much more dynamic than it initially appears. Lumen's body stretches and compresses depending on whether I'm moving up or down, its legs animate, and its eyes shift. Together, these small details give this little blue creature a real sense of life, and they are a major reason the movement feels so satisfying. It also means that, unlike Gemini, I am not spending the first minute trying to establish a diplomatic relationship with the controls. I press a button, the character responds, and this is apparently something I can no longer take for granted, I generally land on the platform I was aiming for. Bingo. The basic structure is familiar. I move through the cavern collecting glowing blue crystals, each of which adds 10 points to my score. The enemies begin as these small purple crawlers that patrol the platforms, and if I land on one from above, I defeat it and earned 20 points. As I continue, Claude gradually introduces new enemy types. The first level mainly has the purple crawlers, the second adds orange enemies that hop into the air, and the third introduces flying creatures that move above the platforms. The checkpoints are another small detail that Claude handles really well. Each one looks like a dim beacon when I first approach it, but when I touch it, the flag lights up, a glowing effect appears around its base, and this is very visually satisfying. Look, the spikes are functional, the moving platforms carry me correctly, and everything else works. I never spawn inside a hazard, and I never find a platform that feels impossible to reach, like ChatGPT. Because everything works correctly from the title screen through the final win screen, Claude earns the full 25 out of 25 for basic functionality. This makes it the only official model in this competition to receive a perfect score in that category. Admittedly, it is easier to avoid breaking things when the game is this simple, but so be it. Once I reach level 2, however, I start to notice that simplicity becomes a limitation, because although the level is called the Restless Depths, it looks almost exactly like the cavern I just left. The same dark purple background remains, and the overall atmosphere barely changes. Then I enter level 3, the Shattering Core, and once again we are inside what feels like another section of the exact same cave. The levels do become longer, but visually there is not enough separation to make them feel like 3 distinct levels. That costs Claude 2 points in the level category, and the limited obstacle variety costs another one because beyond the enemies, the main environmental threat is just another group of spikes sitting on a platform. Those 3 deductions bring the required gameplay to 27 out of 30 points. Now, the larger issue here is that the game never becomes especially difficult, or at least to me. Claude technically increases the number of enemies and hazards in each level, but the floaty movement gives me so much control that I pass all 3 caverns without much trouble. And there's nothing wrong with an easier platformer, and I actually enjoy how smooth and relaxing this one feels. But our prompt specified 3 levels that become progressively harder. It loses 3 points for difficulty progression, bringing the game design to 17 out of 20. Visually though, Claude has done a lot with a fairly simple design. The background contains soft, twinkling stars and cave shapes that move at different speeds as the camera follows me, the crystals rotate and glow, and there are tons of fun animations. The sound effects are where the presentation becomes very slightly less impressive, because while the game includes those basic sounds, they are still fairly simple electronic beeps that don't create much atmosphere beyond confirming that an action happened. That costs Claude just 1 point, but because the theme, animations, effects, and transitions are all handled super well, presentation still finishes at an excellent 14 out of 15. And finally, reliability receives the full 10 out of 10. I can play from beginning to end without encountering any major bugs. So Claude finishes with a final score of 93 out of 100. So now let's round up our final scores. Officially, ChatGPT 5.5 finished first, Claude won second place, and Gemini finished with that bronze medal. Before we end though, ChatGPT just rolled out a new model lineup with the release of GPT 5.6, Luna, Terra, and Sol. The easiest way to understand these models is that Luna prioritizes speed, Terra balances speed with deeper reasoning, and Sol is built for the most demanding tasks. Since I pay for ChatGPT, I have access to Sol Ultra, so obviously I gave it the exact same prompt, and let's see what it comes up with. And guys, what am I even looking at here? This game is called Lumenfall: The Shattered Sky Garden, and from the moment the title screen tells me to begin the ascent, I was shocked by how detailed everything is. Now we see that the first level level, Moss-like Grotto, has an entirely original character, phenomenal gravity, dynamic backgrounds, moving plants, and everything else you could have possibly imagined. And look at the portal transition. Instead of just freezing when I touch it, the code physically pulls my character into the center. That is exactly what I wanted from the original ChatGPT game, and Sol Ultra actually did it. The next level, Copperwind Conservatory, completely changes the atmosphere with hanging gears, copper colors, new enemies, and harder obstacles. Then level 3, Aurora Glassworks, transforms everything again and introduces even more obstacles. This one was genuinely very difficult and I could not pass it to save my life, but that's probably attributed to my mediocre platformer skills rather than the game itself. The final screen even gives you a garden title based on your performance, which is super cool. Now, I'm not officially scoring Sol Ultra because it was only a bonus entry, so you have to do it. Rate this game out of 100 in the comments and tell me whether you think it would have beaten the official winner. Additionally, I have linked a GitHub repository in the description which features all 4 of these games so you can try and pass all 3 levels of each game yourself and score them based on your own judgment. And if you try, definitely don't forget to star the repo for later. Well guys, if you enjoyed this challenge, please remember to drop a like and subscribe, and also check out my other socials linked in the description. With that, I really hope you all enjoyed my first long form video. If you want to see more of this stuff, comment on what I should build next, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.